The world had ended 6 months ago, not with a bang or a whisper, but with the hungry groans of the dead rising to consume the living. Marcus Rivera stood atop the crumbling fire station in downtown Atlanta, his weathered hands gripping the rusted railing as he surveyed what remained of civilization through the orange haze of the setting sun. Smoke still rose from distant buildings, eternal funeral pyres for a world that would never return, and somewhere in the maze of abandoned vehicles and shattered storefronts below, the infected wandered in their endless search for prey. He had been a firefighter once, dedicated to saving lives, but now his only mission was survival for himself and the 3 people who had become his unlikely family in this nightmare. Behind him, the metal door to the rooftop creaked open, and Elizabeth Morrison emerged, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, exhaustion etched deep into her face despite her being only 32 years old. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the horrors lurking in the streets below. He followed her down the narrow stairwell where their makeshift shelter occupied the 3rd floor of the station, a space they had fortified with whatever materials they could scavenge, creating a fortress that had kept them alive through countless close calls. In the corner of their main room, surrounded by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls, 17-year-old Jake Patterson sat hunched over an old ham radio, his young face illuminated by the soft glow of the equipment's dying battery, his fingers adjusting dials with the obsessive focus that had made him invaluable to their group. Beside him stood Amy Chin, her engineer's mind having kept their generator running and their defenses strong, her dark eyes wide with something Marcus hadn't seen in months: hope. "Tell him what you found," Beth urged Jake, and the teenager looked up with trembling hands, pointing at the radio that crackled with static and something else, something that made Marcus's heart race. "It's a signal, a real one, not just automated emergency broadcasts or military warnings," Jake explained, his voice cracking with excitement and fear. "Someone's alive out there, someone organized, and they're talking about something called Project Sanctuary." Marcus leaned in closer as Jake increased the volume, and through the interference, a calm male voice emerged, speaking words that seemed impossible in this dead world. "This is Dr. Raymond Foster broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. If you can hear this message, there is hope. Project Sanctuary is real, humanity can be saved. We have found a way." The message repeated, looping every 60 seconds, and for a moment the 4 survivors stood in silence, barely daring to breathe, barely daring to believe. But their moment of revelation shattered as a sound rose from the streets below, not the random moaning of scattered infected, but a chorus of thousands of voices, a massive horde drawn by some unseen force, moving through the city like a tide of death. Marcus rushed to the window and felt his blood turn cold at what he saw, an ocean of infected bodies flooding the streets, more than he had ever seen in one place, their twisted forms shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space between the buildings. "They're heading straight for us," Amy whispered, her voice tight with terror, and she was right. The horde was moving with unusual purpose, as if guided by some terrible intelligence, straight toward the fire station. "We have 30 minutes, maybe less, before they breach the ground floor," Beth said, her medical training keeping her calm even as panic threatened to overwhelm them all. Marcus made a decision in that instant, the kind of split-second choice that had defined his entire career as a first responder, the kind that meant the difference between life and death. "Pack everything essential, food, water, weapons, and that radio," he commanded, his voice steady and strong, the voice of a leader who had guided them through 6 months of hell. "We're leaving now, and we're going to find this Project Sanctuary, because if there's even a chance that message is real, even the smallest possibility that humanity can be saved, then we have to take it." As the groaning grew louder and the building began to shake with the pressure of thousands of bodies pressing against its walls, the 4 survivors grabbed their supplies and prepared to venture into the dying light, knowing that their journey would either lead them to salvation or to the same fate that had claimed billions, but certain that doing nothing meant death anyway. The escape from the fire station had been a nightmare of narrow corridors and grasping hands, with Marcus leading them through a maintenance tunnel he had discovered weeks earlier, a secret route that opened into the sewers beneath the city where the infected rarely ventured into the complete darkness. They emerged 3 blocks away, gasping for air that reeked of decay and smoke, their boots splashing through puddles of stagnant water as the sounds of the massive horde echoed behind them like distant thunder. For 2 days they moved through the skeleton of Atlanta, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main streets where the infected congregated in terrifying numbers, surviving on adrenaline and the dwindling protein bars in their packs. On the third day, as they cleared an abandoned pharmacy searching for medical supplies, they heard something that stopped them cold. A child's scream, high and piercing, coming from the office building across the street. Marcus exchanged glances with Beth, both knowing that saving others was a luxury they could barely afford, but neither willing to let their humanity die completely, not yet. They found them on the second floor. A woman in her late 30s with kind eyes hardened by loss, standing protectively over a boy no older than 7, surrounded by 5 infected that clawed at the overturned desk barricade that wouldn't hold much longer. Daniel Cooper appeared from the adjacent room at the same moment, a tall African-American man with military short hair and a rifle that cracked with precision, dropping 3 infected before Marcus and Jake could even raise their weapons. Together, they eliminated the threat in seconds, the kind of coordinated efficiency that only came from people who had learned to fight or die. The woman introduced herself as Grace Williams, a third-grade teacher before the world ended, and the frightened boy clutching her hand was Tyler, her son, who hadn't spoken since watching his father get torn apart a month ago. Daniel explained he had been Special Forces stationed at Fort Benning when the outbreak began, and had been surviving alone since his unit was overrun, his voice flat and emotionless in the way of someone who had seen too much death to process it anymore. As they barricaded themselves in the pharmacy for the night, Daniel revealed something that changed everything. He pulled a worn military document from his tactical vest, pages stained with blood and dirt, marked with the official seal of the Centers for Disease Control. "Found this on a dead officer 2 weeks back," he said, spreading the papers on the counter under the beam of Amy's flashlight. "Didn't think much of it until I heard you mention Project Sanctuary on that radio." Beth leaned forward, her medical expertise allowing her to decipher the technical jargon, and her hands began to shake as she read aloud. Subject trials indicate possibility of reversal in early-stage infection. Genetic markers suggest natural immunity in approximately 0.3% of population. Recommend immediate evacuation of immune subjects to secure facility for vaccine development. The word hung in the air between them like a fragile soap bubble. Vaccine, cure, salvation. "This can't be real," Amy said, shaking her head, her engineer's mind rejecting what seemed too good to be true. "If they had a cure, why did everything fall apart? Why are we hiding in a destroyed pharmacy instead of in some government safe zone?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and he pointed to the date on the document. 3 days before the total collapse of all military operations. "Because they ran out of time," he said quietly. "Whatever they were working on, they never finished it or they never got the chance to distribute it." The group fell into heated debate, voices rising despite the danger of attracting attention, the stress of 6 months of survival finally cracking their careful composure. Jake argued they had to follow the radio signal, that Dr. Foster might have completed what the CDC started, while Amy countered that it could be a trap, that desperate people did terrible things, and walking into an unknown location was suicide. Grace held Tyler close, torn between hope for her son's future and fear of risking the only family she had left, and Beth remained silent, studying the document with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something the others missed. Marcus listened to them all, understanding both the desperate need to believe and the reasonable fear of trusting strangers in a world where humanity had turned on itself as quickly as the infected had turned on them. Finally, he raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command that made them all listen. "We're going to find Project Sanctuary," he declared, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "Not because we're certain it's real, but because staying here means slow death, running out of supplies, getting picked off one by one. That radio signal is the first real hope we've encountered, and Daniel's document suggests someone was actually close to a cure. We move at first light, we stay smart, we stay together, and if it turns out to be nothing, at least we'll have tried." As the others nodded their agreement and settled in for a restless night, none of them noticed Beth slipping the document into her bag, her mind racing with a terrible suspicion about what 0.3% immunity really meant, and what price might be required to save the world. Dawn broke over Atlanta with an eerie crimson glow, the sun filtering through the ash and smoke that still lingered in the atmosphere, painting the ruined city in shades of blood and fire. The group of 7 moved through the abandoned streets like ghosts, Marcus at the point with Daniel covering the rear, their expanded numbers both a comfort and a liability in a world where noise meant death. They had plotted a route northward based on triangulating the radio signal's direction, avoiding the major highways that had become graveyards of stalled vehicles and lurking infected, instead cutting through residential neighborhoods where the undead wandered in smaller, more manageable clusters. Tyler rode on Jake's back, the teenager having volunteered to carry the exhausted child, and the boys' small hands clutched Jake's shoulders with a grip born of pure terror every time they encountered the monsters that had destroyed his world. By midday they had covered nearly 8 miles, but the strain was beginning to show on all of them, especially Grace, who wasn't accustomed to the constant physical demands of survival like the others had become. They took shelter in a 2-story house with an intact roof, barricading the doors while Amy worked on boosting the radio signal, hoping to get more information from Dr. Foster's mysterious broadcast, her fingers flying over the equipment with practiced efficiency. What they discovered instead made their blood run cold. The infected were changing, evolving in ways that defied everything they thought they understood about the outbreak. Through the grimy window, Marcus observed a group of the undead moving down the street with disturbing coordination, not the shambling randomness they had shown for months, but purposeful movement, almost tactical, as if something was directing them. One of them stopped directly in front of their hiding spot, its head tilting in a gesture that was horrifyingly human, its clouded eyes seeming to study the house with an intelligence that shouldn't exist. Beth pressed her hand over Tyler's mouth to stifle his whimper, and for 3 agonizing minutes, they barely breathed as the creature stood there, swaying slightly before finally moving on with its group. "They're adapting," Daniel whispered once the danger had passed, his military training helping him recognize patterns that others might miss. "I've been seeing it for weeks now, didn't want to believe it, but they're getting smarter, learning." He pulled out a battered map, spreading it across the dusty floor, and pointed to a location in the North Georgia mountains, about 100 miles from their current position. "There's a CDC auxiliary facility here, built into the mountain itself during the Cold War as a continuity of government site. If Project Sanctuary is real, if someone actually continued the research, that's where they'd be. It's defensible, isolated, and has independent power generation." The revelation gave them a concrete destination, but their relief was short-lived because as they prepared to leave the house, voices echoed from outside, human voices, the first they had heard beyond their own group in weeks. Marcus cautiously peered through a gap in the boarded window and saw them. A group of 6 survivors, heavily armed, moving with the confident swagger of people who had claimed this territory as their own. He might have considered them potential allies until he saw what they were doing, systematically looting every building, taking everything of value, and based on the cruel laughter and casual violence they displayed toward the infected they encountered, these were not good people. Grace wanted to wait them out, to hide until the raiders passed, but Daniel shook his head grimly, pointing out that their own vehicle, a reinforced delivery truck they had acquired 2 days ago, was parked in plain sight behind the house. Sure enough, within minutes they heard the sound of breaking glass and triumphant shouts as the raiders discovered their truck and the precious supplies stored inside. Half of their food, most of their ammunition, and worst of all, the spare fuel cans that were supposed to get them to the mountains. Marcus had to physically restrain Jake from rushing out to confront them, the teenager's anger overriding his common sense, whispering harshly that 7 people, including a child and an exhausted teacher, couldn't win a firefight against 6 battle-hardened raiders. They could only watch in helpless rage as the strangers drove away in their truck, laughing and firing weapons in the air, the noise drawing infected from every direction, creating a surge of undead that surrounded the house within minutes. Trapped, low on supplies, and with 100 miles of hostile territory between them and their only hope of survival, the group faced their darkest moment yet. But as the infected pressed against the walls and the sun began to set, Daniel noticed something on the map he had missed before. A network of old service tunnels that ran beneath the city, maintenance access for the water system, a dangerous path through absolute darkness that might be their only chance. Marcus looked at his exhausted, frightened companions and saw not defeat in their eyes, but determination, the stubborn human refusal to give up even when all logic said they should. "Then we go down," he said simply, and began prying up the basement floorboards, leading them once again into the unknown depths, toward either salvation or doom. The tunnels beneath Atlanta were a claustrophobic nightmare of dripping water, rusted pipes, and darkness so complete that their flashlights seemed to barely penetrate it, creating small islands of illumination in an ocean of black. They had been underground for nearly 18 hours, following Daniel's map through the labyrinth of maintenance corridors, their progress agonizingly slow as they navigated collapsed sections and flooded passages that forced them to wade through chest-deep water that none of them wanted to think about. Tyler had fallen into an exhausted sleep in Grace's arms, the boy's small body limp with fatigue, and even Jake's youthful energy was flagging as they climbed yet another service ladder toward what Daniel promised was an exit on the northern edge of the city. When they finally emerged through a storm drain into the pale light of dawn, they found themselves in the outskirts of what had once been a prosperous suburb, now a wasteland of burned homes and abandoned dreams. They had barely taken a dozen steps when they heard it, a sound that turned their relief into horror, the combined moaning of not dozens or hundreds but thousands of infected, a noise that resonated in their bones and made their survival instincts scream at them to run. Cresting a small hill, they saw what they had stumbled into. A massive horde that stretched across the landscape like a living carpet, easily 10,000 strong, filling the entire valley between them and the highway they needed to cross, moving in that same coordinated pattern that had terrified them before. There was no going around it. The horde extended too far in both directions, and going back meant losing days they didn't have, with supplies already dangerously low. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as he formed them, because fighting was suicide and hiding would only delay the inevitable when the horde's pattern brought them to their location. It was Amy who saw the solution, her engineer's brain processing the landscape and finding an answer that seemed insane but might actually work. An old railway bridge spanning the valley, elevated 50 feet above ground level, with a maintenance platform that could barely fit 7 people if they squeezed together. "We use ourselves as bait," she explained rapidly, pointing to a church bell tower about a quarter-mile from the bridge. "One person rings that bell, draws the horde away from the bridge path, while the rest run for the crossing. Once everyone's across, the ringer escapes through the church basement, I can see the exit from here, and circles around to meet us on the other side." The plan was desperate and required split-second timing, and Daniel immediately volunteered to be the ringer, his military training making him the logical choice, but Marcus refused, insisting that his experience as a firefighter had prepared him for exactly this kind of calculated risk. The next 20 minutes were the longest of their lives, with Marcus sprinting toward the church while the others positioned themselves at the bridge approach, watching him disappear into the bell tower and waiting for the signal. When the first chime rang out, deep and resonant, it was like watching a dam break as the entire horde shifted direction, thousands of infected turning as one toward the sound, their bodies surging forward with terrifying speed. The group ran, Beth practically dragging Tyler while Grace and Jake cleared the few infected that hadn't been drawn away, their footsteps thundering on the metal bridge as the structure swayed dangerously under their weight. They made it across with seconds to spare, collapsing on the far side just as the main body of the horde reached the church, and for agonizing minutes, they heard nothing from Marcus, no radio call, no sign of movement, until finally they saw a lone figure sprinting from a side street, pursued by a dozen infected that had broken off from the main group. Marcus was fast but not fast enough, and as he vaulted over an abandoned car, one of the creatures lunged forward with unexpected speed and its teeth sank into his forearm, tearing through his jacket and flesh with a sickening crunch. Daniel's rifle shot removed the infected's head, and Jake took down the others as Marcus stumbled toward them, his face pale with shock and the terrible knowledge of what a bite meant. 48 hours until the fever started, another 24 until he turned into one of them, becoming the very thing he had fought so hard to survive. Beth immediately began treating the wound, her hands shaking as she cleaned and bandaged it, but they all knew that field medicine couldn't stop what was coming, couldn't prevent the infection that had killed billions from taking Marcus too. But as they prepared to say their goodbyes and discuss what came next, something extraordinary happened. Marcus didn't develop a fever. Hours passed, then a full day, and while the bite wound itself showed signs of normal infection, the characteristic symptoms of the zombie plague never manifested. His eyes remained clear, his mind sharp, his body fighting off what should have been a death sentence. Beth examined him obsessively, drawing blood samples and studying them with a portable microscope salvaged from a veterinary clinic, and her hands trembled as she realized what she was seeing. His immune system was actively destroying the infection, his antibodies attacking the pathogen with unprecedented efficiency. 2 miles further down the road, they found an abandoned military checkpoint, and inside the command center, still powered by emergency generators, Beth accessed files that confirmed her impossible theory. Marcus Rivera was one of the 0.3%, naturally immune to the infection, and his blood might be the key to saving not just themselves, but all of humanity. The coordinates from the military checkpoint led them deeper into the North Georgia mountains, where the paved roads gave way to gravel paths and eventually to nothing but forest trails that seemed untouched by human presence for decades. They traveled for 3 more days, rationing their meager supplies and avoiding the scattered infected that roamed even these remote areas, following the radio signal that grew stronger with each mile until they could hear Dr. Foster's message with perfect clarity, his voice becoming like a beacon guiding them through the wilderness. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as they climbed a particularly steep ridge with Tyler riding on Daniel's shoulders and exhaustion weighing on them all like a physical burden, Amy's equipment suddenly registered a massive electromagnetic signature just beyond the next rise, something that suggested serious power generation in an area that should have been completely dark. What they found took their breath away, A massive steel door built directly into the mountainside, camouflaged so expertly that they would have walked past it if not for the faint hum of generators and the small camera that tracked their approach with mechanical precision. Marcus stepped forward, uncertain what to do, when a speaker crackled to life and a weary voice said, "Please state your names and how you learned of this facility." Beth spoke first, explaining about the radio broadcast, the CDC document, and their desperate journey from Atlanta, her words tumbling out in a rush of hope and fear that this might be another dead end or worse, a trap. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever before the voice replied, "You mentioned a CDC document about immunity. Do any of you exhibit resistance to infection?" Marcus held up his bandaged arm and explained what had happened, how the bite should have killed him but hadn't, and he heard what sounded like a sharp intake of breath before the massive door began to grind open, revealing a brightly lit corridor that seemed like something from another world compared to the darkness and decay they had lived in for months. The man who greeted them was in his late 50s, with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the exhausted eyes of someone who had been working without rest for far too long. Dr. Raymond Foster, the voice from the radio, looking at Marcus like he was seeing a ghost or perhaps a miracle. He led them deeper into the facility, past laboratories filled with equipment that still functioned, past living quarters where a handful of other survivors, scientists, technicians, a few military personnel, stared at the newcomers with expressions mixing hope and despair. In a conference room with maps covering every wall and research data projected on multiple screens, Dr. Foster explained everything, his voice shaking with emotion as he revealed the truth they had risked everything to find. Project Sanctuary had been the government's last desperate attempt to combat the infection, a crash program that had identified the genetic markers for natural immunity and had been developing a cure based on antibodies harvested from immune subjects. They had found 12 immune individuals in the early days, Foster explained, his face darkening with grief, but all had been lost when the facility in Atlanta fell, overrun before the research could be completed, before they could synthesize enough cure to make a difference. He had evacuated here with his team, broadcasting his message in desperate hope of finding more immune survivors, but in 6 months they had found none until Marcus. Beth asked the question they were all thinking. Can you actually create a cure, or was the program just theoretical? Foster led them to a sealed laboratory where vials of amber liquid sat in refrigerated storage, and he explained that the cure worked, that they had successfully reversed infection in test subjects, but the process required fresh antibodies from immune donors, and without any immune individuals, they had been unable to produce more than the few dozen doses they had already created. How many doses would you need to make a real difference? Daniel asked, his military mind already calculating logistics and distribution. Foster's answer hit them like a physical blow. To create enough cure to begin genuinely reversing the outbreak, to treat enough people that they could help us treat others, creating a cascading effect of recovery, we would need approximately 50 liters of antibody-rich plasma harvested over a period of weeks. Marcus understood immediately what that meant, what was being asked of him without Foster having to say the words directly. He would need to give blood repeatedly, pushing his body to its limits, possibly beyond them, becoming a living factory for humanity's salvation. Grace protested that it was too dangerous, that they couldn't ask one man to risk his life after he had already done so much, but Marcus silenced her with a raised hand, his decision already made before the question was fully asked. "How do we start?" he said simply, and Foster's eyes filled with tears of relief and regret, knowing that he was asking this brave man to endure weeks of physical suffering for a chance, not even a guarantee but just a chance to save the world. But before they could begin the process, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility, and a technician burst into the room with terror written across his face. "Dr. Foster, the motion sensors. There are thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, coming up the mountain from all directions. It's like they know we're here." Through the facility's external cameras, they watched in horror as the largest horde any of them had ever seen converged on their location, a sea of infected bodies that filled the forest as far as the cameras could see, and Marcus realized with cold certainty that their greatest trial was just beginning. The facility that had seemed like salvation moments before transformed into a potential tomb as the horde surrounded the mountain, their numbers so vast that the ground itself seemed to vibrate with the thunder of countless footsteps converging on the hidden entrance. Dr. Foster's team scrambled to reinforce the main door, welding additional supports and activating defensive measures that had been installed for exactly this scenario, but everyone could see the fear in their eyes. These defenses had never been tested against a horde of this magnitude, and nobody knew how long they would hold. Marcus was rushed to the medical bay where Beth and Foster began the extraction process immediately, inserting 4 lines and beginning the plasma separation that would take hours to produce even a single viable dose of the cure. time they might not have as the pounding on the outer door grew louder and the metal began to show stress fractures. Daniel gathered the facility's defenders, a pitiful force of just 11 people including himself and Jake, with maybe 200 rounds of ammunition between them and a few improvised explosives that the engineers had constructed from laboratory chemicals. He laid out their situation with brutal honesty. The main door would hold for maybe 6 hours, the ventilation system could be breached in half that time if the infected were smart enough to find it, and their ammunition would last perhaps 20 minutes in a sustained firefight. "We should leave now while we still can," he said, his voice carrying the weight of military pragmatism. "There's an emergency exit tunnel that comes out 2 miles down the mountain. We take what cure samples exist, we get Marcus out of here alive, and we regroup somewhere safer to continue the work." The room erupted in argument, with Foster insisting they needed the specialized equipment in this facility to mass-produce the cure, Amy pointing out that the exit tunnel would bottleneck them where they could be easily overwhelmed, and Grace holding Tyler close while tears streamed down her face, torn between protecting her son and believing in the mission that might give him a future worth living. Marcus, watching from the medical bay with tubes running from his arms, felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. His blood could save the world, but only if they survived long enough to use it, and every minute they stayed increased the chance that everyone would die for nothing. The decision was taken out of their hands when the power suddenly flickered, the generators straining under increased load, and Foster's face went pale as he checked the system's readout. "Something's interfering with our air filtration. The vents are getting clogged, possibly deliberately. If we don't clear them, we'll suffocate long before the doors fail." Jake volunteered immediately to check the ventilation system, knowing the narrow access tunnels that ran throughout the facility like veins, passages too small for adults but navigable for a slim teenager. Grace asked if Tyler could stay with Beth in the medical bay, the safest room in the facility, while she helped prepare supplies for a potential evacuation, and Beth agreed, settling the quiet boy in a corner with a blanket and a worn picture book that someone had saved from before. But 15 minutes later, when Jake returned with news that he had cleared the vents of debris and what looked disturbingly like the infected were trying to dig through from outside, they discovered that Tyler was gone, the blanket lying empty and the medical bay's side door standing slightly ajar. Grace's scream of anguish echoed through the facility as she realized her son had wandered off, possibly looking for a bathroom or maybe just scared and confused in the chaos, and now he was somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors while the infected pounded at the walls outside. Marcus tried to stand to help search, but Beth pushed him back down as the extraction process was only half complete, shouting that if he disconnected now, they would lose the plasma they had already collected and have to start over. Daniel organized a search party, but pulled Marcus aside first and said the words that cut like a knife. "If we don't find him in 30 minutes, we have to seal the inner doors and protect what matters most, the cure. One child's life versus potentially millions. You know I'm right." Marcus did know. Intellectually he understood the mathematics of survival, but the look of devastation on Grace's face as she ran through the corridors calling her son's name made those calculations feel monstrous, inhuman, the kind of choice that destroyed whatever was left of your soul. The pounding on the main door reached a crescendo, and with a shriek of tortured metal, the first breach appeared, a gap no wider than a hand, but enough for the infected to begin tearing at the edges, widening it with mindless persistence. Foster activated the facility's internal defenses, steel bulkheads beginning to descend in sections, creating fallback positions but also cutting off access to parts of the facility where Tyler might be hiding. Jake suddenly grabbed a radio and said he knew where the boy might have gone. Earlier Tyler had been fascinated by the observation deck, a small room with reinforced windows that looked out over the valley, the same deck that now offered a view of the massive horde surrounding them. As Marcus watched his plasma bag slowly filling, knowing that each drop brought humanity closer to salvation, he realized that the next few hours would determine not just whether they survived, but whether they deserved to. Jake didn't wait for permission, he simply grabbed a flashlight and a steel pipe and ran toward the observation deck, his young legs carrying him through the corridors faster than any of the adults could follow, driven by a determination to prove he was more than just the kid everyone protected. He found Tyler exactly where he predicted, pressed against the reinforced glass with tears streaming down his face, staring at the ocean of infected below, the boy finally breaking his months-long silence to whisper, "Daddy's out there," over and over, having convinced himself he had seen his dead father among the horde. Jake scooped him up just as the bulkhead door began to descend, sliding under the closing steel with inches to spare, and sprinted back toward the medical bay with Tyler clinging to him, the building shaking around them as sections of the outer wall began to fail under the relentless assault. Grace met them halfway, collapsing to her knees and pulling her son into her arms, sobbing with relief while Daniel shouted that they had maybe an hour before the infected breached the intersections. Maybe less if the creatures continued showing the coordinated intelligence that had allowed them to find and exploit the facility's weak points. In the medical bay, Marcus had given 4 units of plasma, more than was safe, his face pale and his hands trembling, but his eyes burned with fierce determination as Foster worked frantically to synthesize the cure, using every piece of equipment simultaneously to speed up the process that normally took days. Beth monitored Marcus's vital signs with growing alarm, knowing that one more extraction would push him into dangerous territory, possibly killing him, but when she tried to stop the process, Marcus grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and said, "If I die and it saves the world, that's the best death anyone could ask for." The main door finally gave way with a screech of tearing metal, and the infected poured through like a flood, met immediately by Daniel's carefully prepared defenses, tripwires that triggered chemical explosives, corridors that funneled the horde into killing zones, and the desperate gunfire of defenders who knew they were buying time with their lives. Amy worked frantically to override the facility's power distribution, routing everything to the medical bay to keep Foster's equipment running, even as the lights failed in other sections and the infected surged deeper into the complex, their moaning a constant soundtrack to humanity's last stand. Foster's hands shook as he loaded the synthesized cure into aerosol dispersal units, explaining rapidly that they couldn't inject millions of people individually, but if they could get the cure into the ventilation system and pump it outside, the airborne version might affect the infected within a half-mile radius, potentially curing hundreds or thousands and creating a safe zone they could expand from. Daniel retreated to the medical bay with Jake and the 2 remaining defenders, having lost 3 people holding the outer corridors, his ammunition down to his last magazine, and reported that the infected would breach their position in minutes. Marcus, barely conscious from blood loss, watched Foster work and realized with crystal clarity what needed to happen. Someone had to manually activate the ventilation dispersal system from the control room on the other side of the facility, a room now swarming with infected, a one-way suicide mission. Before anyone could stop him, Marcus pulled the 4 lines from his arms, grabbed a fire axe from the emergency cabinet, and stumbled toward the door, but Grace stepped in front of him and said quietly, "You've given enough. Let someone else carry this weight." Daniel understood immediately and moved to volunteer, but it was Jake who spoke up, his voice steady and mature beyond his 17 years. "I'm the fastest, I know the ventilation system better than anyone and I can fit through the maintenance shafts. This is what I need to do." The argument was brief because time had run out. Infected hands began tearing at the medical bay door, and Jake simply hugged each of them quickly, looked at Tyler and said, "Be brave, little man," and disappeared into the access shaft before anyone could stop him. Through the facility's internal cameras, they watched his progress, this teenager who had been just a scared kid 6 months ago, now crawling through narrow passages with infected below him, dropping into the control room and fighting off 3 of the creatures with nothing but a pipe and pure courage, reaching the dispersal controls and activating them as the aerosol cure began pumping through every vent in the facility and out into the mountain air. The effect was not instantaneous, but within minutes they heard the change. The moaning began to diminish, replaced by confused human voices, by crying and screaming as consciousness returned to thousands of infected, their bodies fighting off the pathogen as Marcus's antibodies did their miraculous work. Jake's voice came over the radio, weak but triumphant. "Did it work? Tell me it worked." And through the cameras they saw him collapse, surrounded by newly cured people who stared at their hands in confusion and wonder, not knowing where they were or how they got there, but human again, alive again. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the facility, now renamed Hope Station, and watched the sunset over a valley that bustled with activity. Fields being planted, buildings being reconstructed, children playing without fear. The cure had worked beyond their wildest dreams, spreading from that first dispersal to reclaim entire cities as they manufactured more, as other immune individuals were found and volunteered their blood, as humanity clawed its way back from the brink of extinction. Jake had survived, hailed as a hero, now training others in survival and defense tactics. Grace and Tyler were teaching at the new school, the boy's voice finally returned, telling everyone about the brave people who saved the world. Daniel coordinated security and rescue operations, Beth ran the medical research division, and Amy engineered the systems that kept their growing community thriving. Dr. Foster had called them the last light of Earth, the final spark that refused to be extinguished, and as Marcus watched the sun sink below the horizon, he thought about how close they had come to losing everything, and how a few brave souls, refusing to give up, had indeed changed the fate of humanity forever. The darkness had descended, but the light had endured, and in that light, a new world was being born.
The end.